Hey everybody, Operation Z here, and we're continuing Abraham's story part 3, and I'm going to redo part 2 before I put it on there, but I'm going to do that next because I had some issues with bouncing around too much and stuff like that, and I'm trying to work on staying on the topic, so I'm just going to go on ahead and redo that before I upload it. But alright, continuing with Abraham's story part 3, Genesis 13:1 says this. So we talked about last time what happened in the land of Egypt with Pharaoh, and I talked about how they how they got out of Egypt and they had a lot of cattle. Abram had a lot of cattle and uh, goods from Egypt, so on and so forth. And I summarized that, so we don't need to go back over where we were in chapter 12. So here in 13:1, and Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. So Abram continued his journeys and went towards the south with his wife and with Lot and with everything that he had, as it says here, and they went into the south. So Genesis 13:2, and Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold. So when they were in Egypt, Pharaoh gave him all kinds of goods with cattle, gold, and silver that he was entreated for because of everything that happened there in Egypt. So we're going to skip ahead to Genesis 13:5. And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. So Lot also has a lot of abundance when it comes to cattle and when it comes to everything that they can have with the flocks and the herds and the tents. And we see that, what happens next here in 13:6. And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. So basically, it was as two princes living together in a way, because Abram had a great abundance of everything that he could have, of flocks and tents. And so flocks, herds, and tents, they had servants. Each one of them did. They had great abundance, and the land was only big enough to bear one of them and not both of them. So it causes a lot of issues and struggles that happen between Abram and between Lot. And we see what happens next here. Genesis 13:7, and there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle. So there's a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled in the land. So there was a strife between them. It means their herdmen were fighting. The herdmen of Abram was fighting with the herdmen of Lot. So we see that, and it also mentions here in that text that where they dwell out in the land, the Canaanite were also dwelling there, and the Perizzite people. So we see that they were there in the land, and we see that basically they couldn't do it. So Abram comes here next to Lot, and he makes a proposition for him. Here in Genesis 13:8, and Abram said unto Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we are brethren. So, just another recap: Lot is the nephew of Abram, and when they were in the land of Haran, Lot, for whatever reason, wanted to come along with Abram to basically kind of start over and find somewhere else. And I've seen from other sources that the land that they were in at that time in Haran wasn't the best land, and that it was pretty much already owned by everyone and whatnot. And eventually God ends up coming to Abram and gives him this blessing and this offering to be his own nation and his own people, where they're, to be nomadic for a certain period of time, and travel in tents, so on and so forth. And eventually we see what happens later on, but I'm not going to skip ahead in this. So that's the promise that Abram gets. But continuing here in Genesis 13:9, is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. So we see the character that Abram has, and that it's a righteous character, that he chooses to put someone else first before himself, because he gives Lot, his nephew, that opportunity to choose whichever land seems better to him. And he said, okay, you can have either this land or that land, and I'll take the other. We see that Abram has that sort of caring and honorable character for his nephew, and or for of himself, but considering his nephew and considering all these things that he could do. He could have said, no, you go this way and I'll go that way. I'll choose because I'm the elder and I'm the, like that. But he let Lot choose where to go. And we'll see in the next part where Lot chooses, and so on and so forth, continuing with the story in part 4. But we just see Abram's character here, and that, we just see that hint of selflessness and righteousness, and he's very honorable. And Abraham is actually known as the patriarch for monotheism, because everybody else had many gods and were polytheistic and dualistic and so on and so forth. But Abram was called by one God, the one true God, the Most High God. And Abram is, known for this, and he's the patriarch of Israel. Abraham is, the one that God chose and that God called to be his peculiar nation of priests, to be his chosen people, and that they'd be set apart and that they be for the Lord. And with plans later on for the Christian faith, everyone everywhere being able to convert and turn to the Lord and ask Jesus into their heart, and then we could all be in the adoption by the Spirit. But, we just see that with Abraham, currently Abram, father of greatness, that basically, back to his character, he had great character. He was courageous. We'll see some of his courage here shortly as we go through the next parts through the storyline. But that's where we're going to stop at for now, and you all have a blessed day.